Seeing none, I'll recognize the next speaker, the Honourable Associate Minister for Reconstruction and Recovery for Southwestern Alberta.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's an honour to rise and speak to Bill 8, the Appropriations Act 2014. Obviously, this is the bill, Mr. Speaker, that sets out the amounts per department that were in the budget and puts them into law for those amounts to then be utilized by the various government departments in delivering public services to Albertans. I do want to provide a number of comments today that focus on a couple key areas that were discussed already as part of this Act and by the Minister of Finance and President of Treasury Board, as well as some of the members of the opposition that have spoken already, and provide a particular context for myself and on behalf of my constituents of Calgary-Klein. The first thing that I do want to talk about is, obviously we've heard from a couple opposition parties that the government can never do enough. There's never enough money for the government to deal with all the challenges that we have, and they are correct, Mr. Speaker. One of the fundamental reasons that we are here as members of the Legislative Assembly is to allocate what is a finite amount of resources in our society to try to make our province a better place to live for those that live in it, our constituents. So there will never be enough money. But what is really interesting is that they continue to perpetuate this plan of spending more and taxing more, whether it's raising royalties, income tax, whatever, that frankly has been rejected by Albertans over and over and over and over again for decades in this province. I can tell you that a significant majority of my constituents do not want their taxes to be raised. They do want the government to be more efficient with their taxpayers' money, and that's what we've set out to do through our results-based budgeting process and the number of steps that we've taken in last year's budget and this year's budget. So, I just can't subscribe to that line of thinking, Mr. Speaker. So I do want to make some comments around what was talked about earlier, actually in question period, by the member of Airdrie, and I think the member of Sylvan Lake referred to it as well. But and it has to do with the budget deficit or surplus that we may or may not have in this province. When the Minister of Finance and Treasury Board tabled his particular budget about a month ago or a month and a half ago, he indicated, as he mentioned earlier today, that we have a consolidated $1.1 billion budget in this province, the first time in 6 years. And that's something that I think every member of this Assembly can be very, very proud of. I know that I'm certainly proud of it. I know that a majority of the work and effort that I put into my time as a member the MLA for Calgary-Klein has been focused in trying to get us back into a surplus position, and this is something that I'm very proud of. But there's been a number of comments, but that this is not true. That, frankly, I get the sense that a number of members, without saying it, have actually said that we're not telling the truth. That we're hiding something. Well, I went back and did an analysis and looked at Budget 2005, one of the budgets, last budgets tabled under former Premier Klein, who these members always high up to the highest standards of fiscal conservatism and responsibility, and looked at how they calculated the deficit that was, or the surplus that was put out there. At that time, they were projecting a $1.5 billion surplus. And so the way that you calculate it, and this is according to public sector accounting standards, the exact same standards that the honourable member from Airdrie was talking about earlier today in question period, and that is by essentially taking revenue, all revenue sources, and subtracting it by total expenses. And that's how you get your surplus. Total expenses are essentially the sum of your program expenses and debt servicing costs. And what goes under program expenses is your base operating expenses, expenses for capital purpose, and any sort of sustainability fund transfers. And that's how you calculate it. One of the things that probably not many members know about, and I'm sure the member from Airdrie for his time on Treasury Board probably understands this, but I would bet dollars to donuts that not very many members over there, and particularly the member from Sylvan Lake who wanted to stand up and suggest that the finance minister didn't know what he was talking about, could probably not tell the difference from a public sector accounting practice, the difference between capital investment and capital grants. Now, they all go into capital projects, and they go into our capital plan, $6.6 billion of it. But some of it is capital investment, and some of it's capital grants. Capital grants are grants that we provide to third-party entities like Alberta Health Services, school boards, municipalities, whatever, that end up going on to own that asset. Capital investment are stuff like roads, provincial roads, not hospitals, corrections facilities, any sort of provincial bridges, any sort of assets that are then owned by the provincial government. Those actually are not counted in total program expense according to public sector accounting standards. It has been like that forever. That's how Ralph Klein used to calculate his budgets, and frankly, it's how every government in this province calculates whether they have a deficit or a surplus position, including the federal government. So when the members over there wanted to stand up and suggest that what a great job Jim Flaherty did for this country, and he did, this was the standard that he used to determine and the calculation whether the federal government was in a surplus or a deficit position. It's funny, I got into this debate on Twitter with the gentleman that perpetuates to represent the taxpayers in Alberta, and he's a well-intending individual, but he threw out two different deficit numbers. He used actually the deficit's actually 2.3 or it's 3.9. And I said, what? How can there be two deficit numbers? How can you have any sort of credibility by saying, well, it actually might be two different things? I said, why don't we just decide to calculate it the way that every other government in Canada decides to calculate it, the way that the the Institute of Chartered Accountants wants us to calculate it when they set out the public sector accounting standards. And by doing that, you get a surplus this year of $1.1 billion, Mr. Speaker, and that's something I think we could all be proud of as Albertans. The second thing that I want to talk about, and it goes to the crux of what I think is a very significant division in this legislature, and it has to do with our capital plan. As I just mentioned, it's actually a $6.6 billion capital plan. It's certainly a little bit more than we anticipated that we were going to spend last year, but we have some significant challenges. Last year when when the budget was tabled in 2013, we didn't have a deal for the southwest portion of the ring road. Last year when we tabled budget 2013, we didn't have the 2013 floods. And so this is a significant difference about the approach around capital and how those capital projects should be financed, Mr. Speaker. Because under the way that the opposition is proposing, they would have had to cut schools, cut roads, cut hospitals, and all other capital expenditures in order to then fund the Southwest Calgary Ring Road. Because they would have had no flexibility. In their 10-year debt-free capital plan provides them with no flexibility to be able to deal with these things that come up on an ongoing basis when you're in government. They would have, in order to put in the mitigation that we're putting in southern Alberta, that we're investing in, they would have had to cut hospitals, roads, and schools. In fact, Mr. Speaker, they would have cut, according to their plan, $2.6 billion out of this capital plan. And if you go to page 72 and 73 of your fiscal tables, there's a capital that were tabled with the budget. There's the capital plan, and it lays out all of the money. I challenged them. I challenged them last year. They couldn't do it, and we were asking them to do cut less money out of the budget. Now they're saying they're going to cut even more money out of the capital budget this year. I challenged them to do it, and they make up this excuse, well, they don't have a priority list. Go to page 72 and 73 of the fiscal tables and do it. Put your money where your mouth is. Because that's what this government is doing. We are talking about Alberta, about building Alberta, and that's what we're doing. A 36% reduction in the capital plan does not cut it. And I want to go back to Ralph Klein. Again, I mentioned this last year. You know, I represent the constituency of Calgary-Klein. I've got a great respect for Ralph Klein and what his legacy was. One of his legacies, of course, was to get rid of the provincial debt. I agree with them. And some might think that we're not meeting those needs or not respecting that by doing what we're doing by capital financing infrastructure projects. One of the other things that Ralph Klein, his legacy is being an honest guy and suggesting that when they've done something wrong, that we should be doing something different and changing courses. He did that very, very well. And so in 2006, he came out and said, yes, we don't have a plan. We didn't have a plan. What they're saying was right. And I tabled the article, the CBC article, last year in the House around this time about that. And he said, we didn't have a plan, but we're working on it. What is would be a shame to Ralph Klein's policy is to not heed his advice and not have a plan to deal with the growth that we're experiencing right now in this province, which is the highest amount of growth that we've experienced in decades and decades and decades. We've increased the population of this province by 25% over the last 13 years, and it's anticipated to increase by another 20% over the next 10 years. That is substantial growth, and these projects cannot be put on hold. It's amazing. The member from Medicine Hat has stood up over the last couple months and asked questions about a hospital. I think it was in Concert or something. He stood up and asked questions about a school that has mold and leaking issues. Oh, the hospital was the one in Sherwood Park, sorry. The minister, or the member for Chestermere-Rockview stood up and asked questions about schools needed in West Calgary. The member for Livingston-McLeod stood up and asked questions about the twinning of Highway 8 and Highway 3. These are all issues that are pressures because of the growth that we're experiencing. And I could tell you this, Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we're going to work very hard to make sure that those projects are going to get done. And I tell you how they're not going to get done, though, Mr. Speaker, or not done as fast as the people that they're asking these questions on behalf of want them to be done, is by cutting $6.2 billion out of the capital plan. That's how they're not going to get done, Mr. Speaker. So with that, I do want to suggest that this is a government that's trying to find balance. We found balance by balancing the budget this year, but we're trying to find balance about living within our means, making government better, making it more efficient, while trying to meet the needs of today, of citizens today, because that's what our constituents want. I know that's what the members in Calgary-Klein want. They don't want me to turn a blind eye to the growth that we're experiencing because I'm ideologically bound to not taking on any debt to build capital projects. Now, yes, our capital plan has grown, and you know, I too will have the same concerns. You know, if our debt levels continue to rise to the point where they're not unsustainable and put us in a very difficult position in the future. But we're a long ways away from that, Mr. Speaker. We have the appropriate mechanisms in place, as the Minister of Finance clearly articulated earlier, to make sure that that doesn't happen. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I just want to say that I'm open to all sorts of debates around whether we're making the right decisions or the wrong decisions. But let's be open and honest and not be blinded by ideology, not be blinded by partisanship. The fact is we have a lot of pressures in this province, Mr. Speaker, and we as elected people, on behalf of our constituents, are put here to meet those pressures while balancing those needs with future generations. You know, I might get into a little bit later when we start discussing some of the pension legislation that's before the House around the complete hypocrisy of what the official opposition is proposing to deal with the unfunded liability and just leaving that for future taxpayers because they're just going to cut it off, defined benefits, and start putting new hires on a defined contribution plan, and the liability, the debt that would leave for future taxpayers, but then they oppose that any sort of debt while putting an asset in the ground. The hypocrisy is amazing, Mr. Speaker, and I think some of those members should be shaking their heads and asking themselves some very serious questions about why they're actually here in this legislature. Is it to win the next election, Mr. Speaker, or is it to serve their constituents and do the right things on behalf of their constituents, not just today, but for tomorrow? Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.